Welcome to Canadian Justice. I'm Christine Van Gyn. Today we're looking into situations where public commentary can get employees into hot water with their employers when they comment on COVID. There are nurses and doctors across Canada who frequently comment on government responses to COVID, and that commentary covers a wide spectrum of opinions. For example, a Toronto area physician has claimed that he was let go from his job because he criticized the government for not doing enough to stop the spread of the virus. And another Toronto area physician was recently reprimanded by the physician regulator for criticizing lockdowns. Where's the line on what public commentary by medical professionals is appropriate and what can get you fired? And who decides what that line is? And what can other types of employers do when they disagree with controversial public statements about COVID that their employees make? Today, we're going to be looking into these questions and more. We're going to be joined first by Dr. Anne Collins from the Canadian Medical Association to discuss the public advocacy role of physicians. We'll then turn to our panel of legal experts on employment law. Dr. Collins, thanks so much for joining me today. Physicians and health professionals have a role to play in educating the public about the pandemic, but there are a wide variety of opinions among these professionals. What guidance do you have for health professionals about public statements on COVID?
One of the beauties of the profession of medicine is that we have a very strong code of ethics. And that code obliges us not only to provide the best patient care possible, but it also obliges us to have a very strong interaction with society in general. And by that means providing science-based, evidence-based advice to public policymakers and decision makers. And so during the pandemic, there's been a huge flood, if you will, unprecedented, of scientific evidence that changes on a very rapid basis. And so although it means sometimes it looks like opinion, in fact, it's catching up with the evidence that comes out at such a rapid pace.
So what is the type of comment that might get a physician reprimanded by, for example, the regulator? What's the standard that the regulator uses?
Well, that's probably a question that's better posed to the regulator. But I would suggest to you that if that opinion is not based in science or what is the commonly held scientific view of the physician community, you're probably walking a thin line there in terms of the support that you bring or the credibility that you bring to that statement.
And so what about statements that might get physicians in trouble with an employer, for example, be it a hospital or clinic? What guidance do you have for physicians in that situation?
So there have been some widely publicized cases lately where it appears that physicians have been reprised for statements that they've made in public. And without knowing the full circumstances behind those situations, it's very hard to comment. But I will say this, sometimes stakeholders want everybody to speak with one voice. But if within that structure, a physician believes that what is being imparted is not based in science, not based in evidence, then really it's also in that situation their duty to speak up about that.
There certainly is not one voice when it comes to physicians. I've seen a huge spectrum of commentary on the issue. We've got about a minute left. Can you tell our viewers if you'd like to see any changes that could allow physicians to speak openly about their concerns when it comes to government policy?
Absolutely, and thank you for that question. With the explosion, if you will, of social media, many physicians have been, some of our most publicly speaking physicians, our chief medical officers of health, have been maligned, have had threats, have had people showing up at their home generated by social media activity. And so there really needs to be a hard look at that, how to control that to some extent, or to at least filter out some of that, so that it's important that physicians feel safe, that they can deliver a message that will it may be a hard message, maybe a hard message to hear, but so that policymakers and decision makers have the best support and evidence provided to them.
Well, it's an incredibly important public role, and I thank you so much for your advocacy. We'll be back after these commercial messages.
Thank you.
Welcome back to Canadian Justice. I'm Christine Van Gyn, and we're discussing what happens if your employer doesn't like your public statements about COVID. Joining me now is our panel of legal experts. Tatha Swan and Catherine Marshall are both employment lawyers based in Toronto. Thank you both for joining me. Now, Tatha, in our last segment, we were talking about employment and regulatory consequences for speaking out about COVID as a health professional. I'd like to follow up with you about that. What would your advice be to a regulated health professional, like a doctor or a nurse, about his or her public comments on COVID? Can someone get fired for criticizing the government, either for not doing enough or for doing too much?
Yes, even employees who work for regulated industries like hospitals, they can get fired for criticizing the government if those comments could affect their employer's interests or the hospital's interests or the hospital's reputation. Because employees owe their employer a duty of loyalty, which means not engaging in commentary or conduct that could be damaging to the employer, which could be reputational or could also affect running the workplace in terms of how these comments might affect fellow employees.
Catherine, same question to you. What are your concerns for health professionals who want to talk about this issue?
Well, I know a lot of doctors actually who told me behind the scenes, Catherine, I feel that I can't say anything. I've had doctors tell me that they are feeling a serious chill from the regulators in their provinces about the COVID issue that never really existed before for any other kind of medical issue. And I, definitely agree, like doctors, like any professional, but especially doctors, they have a certain role in society. They have certain duties to their professional association, but also just to the medical industry as a whole. But, I think some doctors might have maybe some gentle criticism. Maybe they've got a perception or a perspective that they want to share that is medically sound and, not crazy or kooky, and feel that they can't. They feel that they're being watched.
Yeah, I think that there's a lot of commentary that's not so gentle of the government, and I don't have a problem with that. I think that there's a lot of valid criticism, but it's certainly not all gentle criticism that we see out there. Now, Tatha, we have a right to freedom of expression in this country, protected by the Charter. Can you explain to our viewers why that right may not always be and usually isn't applicable in these employee-employer relationships?
Yes, freedom of expression under the Charter protects individuals from government interference with their right to express themselves, which usually means speech, commentary that is public, but it doesn't protect from being sanctioned in terms of employment or being restricted in other ways. Like, for example, a store requiring masks to be worn. You've got to comply if you're going to enter the premises. You've got to comply with what the workplace rules are, which usually require respect in the workplace, appropriate commentary, and not saying things that are critical of your employer or otherwise causing them reputational damage by being sometimes just, taking any political stance at all, even if it's not particularly controversial. Employers don't want to be named on Twitter on any side of any controversial issue. They just want to run their operations.
Catherine, I've got a follow-up question on that for you. How does the Charter apply when we're talking about regulatory consequences for physicians or nurses' statements about COVID?
Well, I think that ultimately, everyone, of course, has freedom of speech. I think that if someone is disciplined by their college, their professional association for espousing a certain viewpoint, there could legitimately be a very good defense case there if really what they were expressing was an opinion that, frankly, was within, the realm of sort of acceptable, fair, educated, and also was delivered in the right form. Like, I mean, there's one thing for doctors to go on Twitter and start, tweeting conspiracy theories. But what about a physician who's giving a lecture to students and shares some viewpoint? So context is really important there. And I have a big problem with employers who, discipline, fire, whatever you want to call it, employees who express opinions that they don't like. I think it's very subjective, and
Absolutely.
I've seen some cases that are very concerning.
Welcome back to Canadian Justice, where we're discussing what happens if your employer doesn't like your public statements about COVID. I want to move now into the general employment area. Catherine, in the regulatory context, if someone decides, outside of the regulatory context, if someone, just a regular employee just starts posting, conspiracy theories about COVID on their social media, like the typical silly things that you see out there, could get this kind of commentary get them in trouble with their regulatory, things like the pandemic is a hoax, or the vaccines contain microchips. We've all seen these things out there. Could you get in trouble with work even if that's on your personal account?
Because if you're a physician, I mean, you've got a certain duty that you owe to the public. And
Sorry, I mean outside of the physician context. I mean, just say you're a bank employee.
Oh, okay, right. If you're not a physician, that's a good question. If it started trending on Twitter and there was a BuzzFeed article about it, maybe. If no one saw it and it got 2 likes from your cousin and your aunt, probably not. And this is part of the problem. And Tatha hit it straight on the head. Employers do not want to end up in the news. They don't want to be trending. And that is the thing that they care about the most.
Now, does the content matter? Does it matter which side of this coin you fall on? Let's consider the reverse scenario, Tatha. I've seen people posting equally extreme things on social media, saying, reopening the economy is negligent homicide by the government. Can criticism like that get someone in trouble on their personal account?
Yes. So to answer your question, though, I think that the content does matter. Because it will dictate the kind of sanction that's likely to stick, and whether they actually get terminated for it, or whether they're terminated for cause and they get a severance package or not. But also, I think it's just so important to flag that what is private and what isn't, because what I've seen happen is, a conversation videotaped, private, just put on social media, but you're connected to 100 people, maybe 1,000 people. They post it, mainstream media grabs it, they call for an interview, and all of a sudden it's in the news. And the content at that point almost doesn't matter because the employer's name is now linked to some controversy.
Now, let's imagine if the comments that you're making, instead of, on private social media, what if you're making them in the workplace, saying these extreme comments when you're, to your coworkers, just, on coffee break? Does that change the analysis?
Yes, it's less likely to have an impact on the employer's reputation, but it can be disruptive to other workers in the workplace. Usually it comes to employers' attention when another employee complains about it, most commonly, whether they don't like the tone, they don't agree with the opinion that's being expressed, or it's being expressed frequently and it's disrupting their work, and they want to work. They don't want to hear political discourse or whatever someone else's opinion is. And in that case, usually a warning will flag that with the employee to say, please keep opinions, to yourself in the workplace. We're here to work.
So, Catherine, what about sort of more nuanced criticism? There's a lot of that going around, sort of in the middle. I think there's a lot of reasonable ground for valid criticism of the government. Either they're not doing enough or they're doing too much. What if you make those types of comments that are, less extreme on social media? Is there a risk of consequence from your employer for that type of criticism?
I mean, I think anytime you're publicly sharing opinions, there's always a risk your employer is going to see that, and someone in the management of your employer is going to have some offense to it. I mean, if your employer is somehow dependent on government contracts or something, and you're out there criticizing the government, that might be a problem for your employer. But I think the tolerance for what is considered fair criticism is increasing as the pandemic is going on. We see like the Conservative Party is criticizing, vaccination rollout. Well, I mean, there's so much criticism out there that is not linked to conspiracy theories, but is actually just fair, valid criticism. And people have a right to have their views. And I don't think people's employers can put limits on that.
Yeah, I think everyone probably has some type of opinion about how the government has done responding to this pandemic. I'm going to follow up with you guys with a few more questions about this important issue after the commercial break. Welcome back to Canadian Justice. Let's jump right back into it with our conversation about employment law and COVID. Tatha, let's look at the employer perspective. What is your advice for employers who are concerned about the conduct, either at work or privately, of their employees as it relates to COVID commentary?
Well, first they should ensure they've got policies to address social media posts and like any communications outside the workplace that could become public as a result of and result in attention directed towards the employer. And that's going to help set employee expectations as well in terms of what can happen and hopefully prevent any accidental scandals that the employee didn't want to incur and affect their employment. And it also helps support the employer if and when they decide to discipline or terminate that employee, because they can now say, well, you used poor judgment and you breached our policy, so maybe now we're not going to give you a severance package when we exit you.
Now, Catherine, what about if a person ends up actually contracting COVID? It moves beyond just, commentary. What if they get COVID and as an employer that they've made comments about COVID, expressing skepticism? What if they then get it and then spread it at work? Could there be employment consequences? Can the employer let them go in that situation?
Well, I don't think an employer can fire someone if they got COVID and spread it at work, especially if they didn't know that they had COVID and it was totally involuntary. But
let's say the conduct suggests that there might have been some recklessness.
Yeah, I mean, that's really hard to prove because the employer would have to do like a deep dive investigation and like start asking questions like, did you ever get tested? Do you believe in COVID? And I mean, look, most employers, and Tatha can tell you, like, they're not going to fire someone for cause unless they've got a really good reason to. But definitely employers have a right and an obligation to ensure that their workplace is safe and that there's measures in place to make sure that people are not coming to work not coming to work ill, and that they're being screened and everything like that. Firing someone for being maybe negligent and reckless, putting themselves in a situation to catch COVID, I don't know if that's something that could amount to a termination.
Tatha, do you have a view on that?
I agree with Catherine that the employer is going to have possibly an uphill battle to show that the behavior actually how do you prove that someone was at a party on the weekend without witnesses, who your witness is going to be? However, if they admit to this, and if they in fact admitted to conduct that breached government regulations quite clearly, and then or maybe they knew they had symptoms related or unrelated to that behavior and came into the workplace, that looks culpable. But again, it proves, or it comes down to, have they admitted it, or are you going to have to prove it to establish that kind of blameworthy behavior?
Now, Catherine, we've only got about 20 seconds left. In your closing remarks, can you say what someone should do if they believe they were wrongly let go from their job for expressing their views about COVID?
I mean, definitely they should contact a lawyer. and see if they have a wrongful termination case, and document their termination or their emails, screenshots, make sure they've got all that. But talk to a lawyer first before they go out start making claims that they are fired for saying certain views.
Great advice. Thank you both so much for coming on and sharing your views. I think I've heard from so many people about their employment concerns on the topic of COVID, and your insight today has been really valuable. So thank you so much.
Thanks, Christine.
Thank you.
We've heard today about concerns employers may have about public statements that their employees make about COVID, and the unique role that health professionals have in speaking publicly about the virus. There's a crucial role that physicians play in contributing to the public policy debate. But not all physicians agree. ICU doctors may have a very different view of lockdowns from pediatric psychologists. These voices are valuable. And in my view, employers and regulators should be extremely careful about anything they do that could silence those voices. Regulators are subject to the Charter, which protects freedom of expression. But of course, the Charter does not apply in regular employer-employee relationships. So what do you think? Should professional regulators be able to discipline health professionals for their public statements about COVID? Are some types of statements more likely to be punished than others? And what can regular employees do to ensure they don't get in hot water at work because of their private views? You be the judge. I'm Christine Van Gyn, and remember, a freer Canada starts with you.